Thank you so much for being on the Future of the Human Experience. For everyone that's listening, we have a very special guest. We're based out of Denver today, recording this episode with Dr. Ulcca Joshi Hansen. Thank you again for being part of this conversation.
Thank you for having me. Always love talking to you.
Yeah, so for behind the scenes insight, we had a chance to connect actually online when your book, The Future Smart, came out.
Right.
What was it, maybe 3-4 years ago now?
2021.
2021.
Yes, September.
And I remember when this book came out, not only did it resonate with me, but it gave me some interesting concepts on talking about the future of the human experience, but from an education standpoint, how we're preparing. And I thought it was not only one of the most thoughtful books around this space, but also how you were engaging with the community online to talk about your work. And you were so gracious that when I reached out, you were like, yeah, let's make some time to connect.
I loved it. I'm so glad we did.
So I appreciate it, Ulcca. But with that said, you've been also on this journey for not only when this book came out, but years before that. What has been your inspiration to dive into this work and this human-centered future that you've been trying to build out in our communities?
So when I was doing research for the book, I came across this term, third culture kid. And the term helped me make sense of something about myself that I'd always known, but I didn't have words for. And a third culture kid is somebody whose parents grow up in one culture, you grow up in a second culture, and at some point you live in or are exposed to at least one other. And the cool thing about people like us who are third culture kids is we're able to navigate across contexts and cultures. The hard part is that we often don't feel like we belong anywhere. And I think without even being conscious of it, this kind of desire for a sense of belonging is something that really pulled at me. And when I first became a teacher, I was going to see a lot of different schools. And I found some schools that sort of tugged at that thing in my heart. And I think that's what drew me to it initially. And then I was really intrigued by how are these schools different? What makes them different from so many of the public schools that I've been in? And that was sort of more of an academic journey. But I think it was that heart space that was the first thing.
Yeah, and I think what I also find fascinating about your work is that you've been talking about this future that's moving super fast and it's getting digitized, but to focus on the humanity of our students and the next generation. Tell me a little bit more about how did you see this so far ahead that the world outside of the classrooms were changing, but we had to change something systematically in our schools as well?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think maybe it has something to do with just how I see the world, which is I think I just believe that we are all part of something larger. My family is Indian, so they would probably say you're Hindu by culture. And that idea that we are all connected and that life is so much bigger, right, often than what we see. And I'm a philosopher by training. And so even that, right, this question of thinking about ethics and what is the good life and what does it mean to be a person, to me, those felt like they should be the driving questions in education, not what college are you going to go to, how are you going to contribute, right, economically. That is important. But to me, the bigger question should be, how do we actually help to grow human beings who have what they need to thrive in life and have an understanding that who they are helps to build the world, right? And then build a world that is one in which we can all thrive.
I love that. Okay. And not only that, but you started this work also even before becoming a mother as well. How has that changed either your approach or your perspective in this work that now you have 2 kids too that are in the next generation?
Yeah, I dedicated the book to them, because I think the thought of them was this inspiring piece of, my own parents were amazing and the relationship I had with them was of one kind. And I think I wanted to raise my children in a way that took the best of that and also allowed me to go deeper with them. And so I think these kinds of schools, again, like when I walked in, you could see that the adults and the children belonged to each other and inside of a space. And then, they're now 17 and 15. I was saying to somebody that their education itself has not necessarily been in the kinds of schools that I study. But I think the thing I've come to appreciate and that I tell a lot of parents is it's a mindset, right? This idea of being human-centered in how you approach education. Yes, the structures are nice, right? All the tools and the other bells and whistles are nice. but it's about, do you see the world as a place where everything is a learning experience? Every conversation you have, right? You can learn something from. And so I do feel like I hope that we've imparted that in them so that regardless of what they're doing, they're kind of having that approach to who they are as people.
And Ulcca, how does that even change now from, as you've been navigating this work, as you've been having these conversations, not only with schools, but also with folks outside of the school, what would you say to those parents today, or those thought leaders today, or those professionals today that they're like, I didn't have the schooling experience that Ulcca promises that we can have in the future. What can I do today, either in my organization or in my company, to be much more human-centered in this digital world?
So in one of my TED Talks, I talk about the 3 R's in a slightly different way. So relationship, relevance, and reintegration, right? That everything starts with the quality of the relationships we have. It isn't a functional thing. It's foundational for us as people. So how do we focus in on the quality of relationships? And that seems really easy to say, but I would argue that most of us are not taught how to be in authentic relationship with ourselves or with other people. And so it really is, I think, something that we learn. So relationship is first. Relevance is the other, right? It's a deeply human thing to ask, why should I care? Why should this matter to me? And so whether you're an employer with, staff, or you're a teacher, how do you help answer that question so that it gives somebody a sense of purpose and meaning? And then reintegration, we live in a world that pulls us apart, right? It pulls our attention apart. It pulls subjects apart. It pulls ideas apart. How do we, again, help people see the whole and see who they are and what they're contributing as part of something bigger, right? So that they can feel like, yes, they are doing this thing now, but it's part of this bigger piece. So I think those 3 R's can be a very different starting point for conversations about cultures and places and spaces.
And in your TEDx talk, and you have a couple, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Audience, please feel free to Google it, or we'll put links also on the show notes. With that said too, when we talk about the relationship piece, you and I have also spoken about this concept of frictionless relationships, right? Can you share with us a little bit more about what is that idea and some of the challenges that we're facing today around navigating what a frictionless relationship could be?
So this is where, a background in neuroscience and development is interesting. The human brain is plastic, and it's shaped by the experiences that we have. And the brain, in many ways, is wired to grow when it encounters things that are difficult or challenging. And I think in many ways, and this is certainly something I've seen in parenting, that there is this effort with the best of intentions to say, we want to take away as much as we can from our children's, path. So we don't want them to fail. We want them to feel good. We don't want them to be upset. And I think we've actually created a world in which many young people, and I'll speak from that, but I think it's true of adults too, don't develop the skills that they need to be in a moment where they're rubbing against each other in ways that are uncomfortable, right? And it is creating friction, and it is creating discomfort. And my worry is that, whether it's social media and algorithms that allow us to get things into our feed that further our own ways of thinking or put us in contact with people who are like us, or if it's things like chatbots, that we are now seeing more and more people are having relationships with them, and that they are designed to be kind and really enthusiastic and supportive. So I worry that if we're not thoughtful about how we continue to allow our lives to brush up against other people and other things and other encounters, we're going to have much more of what we're already seeing. I think on TikTok, there's this trend. It's called resistance therapy or something like that. But basically people are rejection therapy. So you're going out and you're asking people things so that you can be rejected, so that you can learn how to be rejected. And I'm thinking, wow, like your first encounter with that could be on the playground, right?
Yeah.
When you want to play with another kid and they're mean. And I think we've just got to bring that back into how we raise our children so that they're resilient in a world that's not always going to be simple and frictionless.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes there's this perception that because of technology, it's given us opportunity to lower a lot of barriers for us to build connections, even lower, to a certain extent, even the borders that we've created around the world so we could connect with other individuals. But I'm really intrigued by that concept of but it's also creating some additional bubbles to a certain extent, right? And it's giving us that sense of of belonging, but in a different way.
Yep.
And that might not be as authentic as we think it could be. And we need to be much more thoughtful in exploring how to bring those together.
And I think I appreciate you saying that, right? Because so many times we have these conversations and it's technology is all bad or technology is going to save everything. It's a tool. It's like anything else. And we've got a lot of choices to make, I think, in the relatively short term that are going to determine how we get the best out of it and how we are thoughtful about the potential risks and harms and mitigate them just as we move forward. And I think we saw that not happening on social media platforms 15 years ago. So my curiosity is how can we be better this time, right? In terms of being more thoughtful about the full breadth.
And Ulcca, would you say that thoughtfulness, or let me step back, what is the role of community when it comes into building a thoughtful deployment when it comes to different type of solutions? If either it's in education or it's in a corporation or if it's in politics or governance, where does the role of making sure I'm connected with my community but listening to my community play into how we solve problems in the 21st century?
So in general, and this is funny for me to say because I am a lawyer by training and I've worked in policy, right? And policy often sits at this 20,000 foot level. But the more I've seen, the more I'm convinced that human beings and human communities are supported by systems that are more ecological in nature. And in any ecological system, it is not top down, right? Ecological systems start in communities or in spaces. Think of the human body, right? Things are not happening from the brain down. Things are happening inside these smaller systems that then are connected up to one another to further something that's of common interest and need. And I think that's how we should be thinking about the ways in which we think about solutions and systems is how do we start as close to the people we care about and the communities we care about, let them kind of figure out some of the things that they need, and then let's figure out structures on the top that actually allow them to be supported in doing that, and then you keep building up.
Okay. And then, in what role would you say, or where have you seen technology play a role in helping build those systems or listening to communities in certain ways to say, hey, I could be successful with either a deployment of a certain type of solution in these spaces, either in education or outside of education? I
mean, look, Maria Montessori founded and started her school, right? And the Montessori method by being in Italy in the slums where she was working with children, right, who were poor and didn't have access to things. She watched them. She saw them. She saw that they were being dismissed as not intelligent and not smart. And she was like, no, I'm seeing something different. And she developed everything she does, right, out of that observation of the children and then built a system around that. So in the education space, right, I think that's a beautiful example. There's ones I talk about in the school, a high school called Big Picture Learning, that whatever community it's in, it says, who are the businesses, the nonprofits, and how do we get our high schoolers out doing meaningful internships at these places in their community, and then we roll that back into their education. So lots of that. And then I think on the tech side, I've been really impressed with PlayLab, which is a new endeavor that is trying to help educators, parents, teachers, community members build apps. So they're teaching people how to design apps to kind of address different challenges that they're finding, whether it's, hey, how do I start a project? Or how do I, communicate with parents about difficult things? And so I think it's only just beginning, but I think it's very interesting, the apps that have been developed, because they're inviting educators in to be the ones designing them. And I'm hoping that our tech folks, right, in the tech world will take note of that, right, and partner with educators and communities to start building apps.
Yeah, that reminds me of a really interesting company too that opened up during 2020 as a response to how do we connect with students during COVID. It was a company called Unruler. And they're based out of Hawaii. And it was this company that they started off by simply trying to figure out how to stay connected with the kids as they were doing their projects. And they started sharing some pictures with each other and with the teachers. And they said, well, instead of sharing pictures, how do we create a platform so these pictures could be shared across the classroom? And then they started noticing that kids started commenting on each other, on their work, and figuring out how to improve their work. And they said, well, why do I just have it isolated to my classroom? What if I invite an expert in building this particular project, and he or she could comment on this particular project.
Yeah.
And then from that became like this portfolio-based approach to education.
Yeah.
And now they've been on this journey for the last 4 years and just simply just saying, hey, how do I listen to my students first, keeping them in mind first, and then I build these systems around. And I love that you just shared. Now putting that together, now I can figure out how Unruler fits into that picture as well as that example. Ulcca, with that said, let's go back to the third culture kid conversation that you've been trying to build out as well. As someone too that resonates with that message, as someone too that's raising kids like that as well, what have you seen now, and not only in our communities today, but just around the world? I mean, are we just also just normalizing what it is to grow up as a third culture kid today? Are you seeing more and more this conversation resonate with communities, with families, and with companies on how they're connecting with their employees as well?
Well, I'm curious whether it will resonate. But I think if we expand the concept of third culture kid, historically that has been about culture or race or ethnicity, sort of where you live geographically. But we know that culture is so much more than that. So if I'm a politician, there is a culture that I operate in. If I'm LGBTQ, if I'm a gamer or somebody in Comic-Con, right? All of these are subcultures. And so all of us, especially as the world has gotten bigger and less big in terms of being able to connect with people, we are constantly navigating multiple cultures and multiple identities. And I think some of what we're seeing in the world today, right, again, go back to like the basic human need to feel like you have a solid sense of identity, where you belong, who you are. When that is threatened or rattled, right, it lights up that part of our brain that goes danger, right? And we kind of go inward, or we tend to find our cliques and our tribes, and we feel inclined to attack things that feel dangerous, which can be anything. And when I look at some of the populism, when I look at some of the anti-immigrant, as I think about some of the rhetoric in the US about, you know, this is what America is, it's not this. I think it actually is maybe more a reflection of the fact that we're a country and we're now a world in which there's a lot more mobility and fluidity around definitions of identity and who we are. And how do we help people navigate that more intentionally? Like, what is there to learn from people who've done it intentionally? But I think that to me is the relevance of that conversation right now, because we have to help people come back into feeling like they have a stable, rich sense of themselves, because I think that is the foundation for being able to like hold space for somebody else to come to you who is different and let them be who they are without it feeling like it's threatening to you.
And Ulcca, with that said then, so and how do, for example, organizations or companies that are saying, hey, you know, I am pro DEI, I'm pro diversity, equity, inclusion, but they struggle sometimes to lean in fully into that, or their employees are probably not, they're saying, hey, that's what the headline says, but I still don't feel included in this space. What can some of the leaders that might be listening to this conversation today be doing today to help navigate some of that fluidity that either, again, as even the workforce becomes more global, we could help these organizations navigate these conversations and help them find not only a sense of belonging, but have that sense of, wow, I really not only want to work here, but I want to thrive here.
Yeah. Okay, so to answer that, let me just give you one framework that is like a way, it's a heuristic that helps me make sense of the world. So there is this guy named Ian McGilchrist. He's a neuroscientist and a psychiatric practitioner in the UK. And a long time ago, he began asking the question, why does the brain have two hemispheres that sometimes work together and sometimes the corpus callosum inhibits one side versus the other? This is not, I'm right-brained, I'm artistic, I'm left-brain analytic. Everything we do requires our whole brain. But the two halves of the brain, hemispheres of the brain, do two different things. The right hemisphere is like this big end of a funnel, because at this moment, you and I are sitting here and we're taking in hundreds of data points, right? Large flows of information. Left hemisphere takes all of that richness and complexity and simplifies it so that we can navigate the world. When the brain is working properly, things start in the right, they go to the left, they go back to the right to be used in context. We might call that wisdom. Ian and a lot of folks who are in this work with him would argue, and I think they're right, that we're in a world right now that is very left hemispheric dominant. And one of the things that happens when that is true is that we begin to try and understand the world in these fragmented pixel points. And we try to label everything. And we try to have frameworks that are very linear and simplistic. And some of our DEI initiatives, I think, with the best of intentions, I think have been using ways of inviting people, or maybe not inviting them into the conversation, in ways that are so much about frameworks that they don't actually invite them first to come in as people and remind them that they are people sitting here with other people, to connect them first as human beings, and then invite them into conversations like, where are our stories the same? Where are they different? Where do they overlap? Right? And then to actually help people build skills, because I think the world helps us develop left hemispheric skills very well. Right hemispheric skills, not so much. But right hemispheric skills are the ones that let us sit and just accept things for what they are, right? And I think what we want ultimately with DEI initiatives is this ability for people to be able to sit in spaces where there are differences and complexity and let things be, and to be able to be in the richness of it. And so I think we've got to shift how we do DEI to be less about this training, this program, this framework, and much more about how do we actually kind of reset the ways in which we have relationships and bring our people, our stories and our humanity first, so that we can then, begin to sort of appreciate, see, and make space for the differences.
Oh my God. So yes, absolutely. I think that not only resonates with me, but I think that's resonating even with the conversation we're trying to have today, as these spaces are starting to cross each other as well. And unfortunately, sometimes the DEI, when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, could be used in a negative connotation when, again, like you were sharing, the spirit of this work has always been, frankly, for us not to be doing this work in 20, 30 years. It's honestly there for us to disrupt ourselves. And there's absolutely additional business cases for it and what have you. With that said too, Ulcca, one of the things that I know you're working on too is helping individuals or organizations find not only those spaces, but recognizing the importance of resetting. And I know you and I were having a conversation the other day about how sometimes even in the technology space, as technology becomes more prevalent around us, the premium experience becomes the human experience, right? That we use technology to find our way to certain places, probably to find certain activities, but the human experience to sit there with someone or to sit in this activity or just to be present, it feels even much more rewarding today than it probably did maybe 40 years ago. Can you tell us a little more about that space and about that work that you not only recognize that it's important, but recognize why do we need to be doing this today more than ever in this 21st century?
I think there are a couple of layers to that. I mean, the first is just this idea of rebringing us back into shared experiences. So I was in Philadelphia a few months ago for the eclipse, and everybody poured out into this park in Philadelphia to watch this thing together. And how often do we do that? Maybe at live sporting experiences, maybe at in theaters or at concerts, but it's very rare now that we have shared experiences. I was trying to explain to my kids, I was rewatching Friends because that's my high level activity at the end of the day these days. But I was like, Friends would come out and you would bring people in and you would watch it together. And then the next day at work, people would be talking about it. And we don't have that. And I think as the world has become more atomized and has given us more opportunities to just sit in our own space and everything comes to us, like that need to be together, that's a human need. Our brains are wired for that, right? We have to pay attention to that. The other piece, though, I think is really about cognition, intelligence, and again, our brains. But AI, as we currently have it, and large language models and generative AI, are actually replicating a lot of the things that we have historically associated with human cognition, right? Which is very brain-based and brain-based cognition. And there are three other kinds of cognition that we don't talk a lot about. It's a philosophical construct called the extended mind. And Annie Murphy-Paul has written a really great book on this called The Extended Mind. But there are three other kinds of cognition. There's embodied cognition, there's situated cognition, and there's socially distributed cognition. As human beings with biological bodies, those are our comparative advantages. Because artificial intelligence, I don't even love that term, right? Because there's mycelial intelligence, animal intelligence, human intelligence. This is substrate, non-biological intelligence. And it can do some things, but it doesn't have our bodies. So embodied cognition is the idea that our bodies actually think. We know we have a second gut in the brain. Anybody who knows how their body is like feeling at any given moment, we call it intuition, but that's embodied cognition. Situated is my brain doesn't think the same way when it's sitting inside of a building with cement walls as it does when I'm outside in nature, right? So the circumstances we find ourselves in shape our thinking. And distributed cognition is really this idea that the human brain is wired for storytelling. And when we are with other people, our brains begin to be in sync, and we can think in different ways than we can alone. And when we have generative AI and we know it's going to advance, it already is, it seems to me that leaning into those other kinds of cognition are really important. And that requires us to be in the presence of and in community with other people. And in the presence and in community, right, with ourselves.
And that's the space that's not replaceable.
No.
Right? That is the space that, if we lean in more to that, that is the superpower in this age of AI.
Yeah, it is.
So Ulcca, your work as far as navigating the complexities of the education system, challenging some of the norms, really, frankly, being an outlier in this space probably for decades, and now having these conversations about a human-centered education system, it's been, I think, frankly, refreshing from a personal standpoint, not only as a fan of your work, but also as a parent. But now let's look at it from the corporation side. I mean, if we think education is a challenge, the corporations are navigating that exact same complexity, right? They've been built for either years or decades as far as an extension of how we've trained workers, how we train the next generation of leaders in these companies or these organizations, these employees. What would be some of those lessons that you learned on helping navigate the change in education to bring a more human-centered approach that you could recommend for companies or organizations that recognize this change is coming and recognize they need to make it, but they also understand the complexities of it? What would be some of the recommendations you would have for them?
So again, I sort of invite folks, and when I'm presenting, I have this image, this graphic that I use, but let's zoom up to 10,000 feet for a second, because I think sometimes understanding the nature of why things are so challenging is helpful. Right? It helps us stop being as frustrated. But when I talked before about the right and left hemispheres of the brain, there's sort of a corresponding way of understanding the world to each of those, right? And most human cultures and communities historically we understood ourselves to be part of a whole, connected, located and embodied in time and space and place. And for many reasons in Europe during the time of the scientific revolution, there was this kind of dominance of a different metaphor of like the world is a machine. And a machine is nice because you can take it apart, you can see the pieces and put them back together again. It's a very mechanistic, kind of reductionist way of understanding the world. It's really important. We have the COVID vaccine as quickly as we did because of that. And that Cartesian Newtonian way of being in the world is very left hemispheric. The other holistic indigenous way of being in the world is more right hemispheric. And I would argue that part of what we're seeing in society generally right now is that we have this overdominance of left hemispheric Cartesian Newtonian systems that tend to be very fixed, very rigid, very sort of like mired in assumptions and ways of operating that may have worked at one time, but as the world has gotten more complex, as we've had to like be more nimble and change, those structures kind of hold us back. And so on this graph, and I always start with physics because most people are less emotionally like, lit up by physics. But I say, the Cartesian Newtonian physics is absolutely correct.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have computers and cell phones if we didn't understand quantum physics, this bigger aperture, and how it relates to Newtonian physics. Same way, classical economics is fine, but most people, anybody who manages human beings, knows that behavioral economics is probably a better indicator of how economic systems actually work and people make choices. So I would say, for folks in business and nonprofit, right, let's just say that it's not that we are bad, it's not that people are bad or badly intentioned. We are stuck inside of systems that were built at a certain time. So if we can say that, then I think we start with, so what is it that we really do want to get to? And if we're talking about human-centered spaces or spaces that have room for the flexibility of human beings, whether it's how long we work, how we treat one another at work, how we do performance reviews, how we onboard people, right? If we want to be more human-centered, then can we actually get our minds out of maybe how we've always done things and start designing from a sense of, okay, we want to center relationships, and we want people to feel connected, and we want them to feel like they're part of a whole. And how would we design systems differently? And I sometimes think that tinkering with the existing systems, it doesn't work because the DNA of the system eats it all up again. And so how about we create some research and development space to pilot slightly different ways of doing things that are disconnected and sort of, you just have flexibility. And then once you do that and pilot it, see how it goes, and then you can sort of put that out.
Learn
and
from
let it be more, let it take over the ways in which you operate overall.
You remind me, Ulcca, of an example of me tinkering with the space in corporate America. We were, we're interviewing for, a position that was open, and in typical, hiring practices way, we try to systematize everything, right? And so you're given, the 10 questions you need to ask, and we kind of sorted through some of the questions, who's going to ask what, who's going to ask the other ones. We have a scoring mechanism, right, that again is standardized. And again, you do it in the spirit of, hey, we want to make sure we create an equal, unbiased experience for everyone that's here. That's perfect, right? Absolutely, it makes sense. But you're right, when you over-systematize sometimes, the experience becomes, I love what you said, mechanized, right? I could predict the outcome of this, right? Like if it was a football player or something, or a baseball player, even though those are very unpredictable. And so in my tinkering experience, one of the things I did was I threw in a curveball question at the end. And my question was, what is the one strength that you have and then you haven't had a chance to utilize yet, but that this job could help you do that?
Oh, that's a great question. I love it.
And of course, when I asked that question, my fellow colleagues, they're like, what did you just do?
Like, did you do that?
Why did you ask that? But the person that received that question responded exactly like you did. It's like, wow, thank you. No one's ever asked me that. And they felt seen. Like they had prepared for these other 10 questions that were, again, systematized. You could probably Google 80% of them, some form or fashion. But this one was like, no, this is unique to me. And they felt seen, they felt of service too, because it was like, that was the spirit of that question. It's like, well, if you're going to take this job, how could this job help you?
Right.
How could this job help you grow?
When you were talking, it sort of made me think, and this has happened in education, and I'm curious whether you feel like it's happened in corporate America too, but in an effort often to be like, we want to be fair, we want to be efficient, right? We want to do things properly and kind of do them equally. We standardize to the point where we don't allow for humanity to exist because human beings aren't standardized and rigid. And instead, like in education, right, we had, okay, these are the academic standards and every kid is going to get here through this way at this pace. Instead, I think maybe we standardize processes, or we have guidelines and guardrails that ensure, right, that, and people are doing this now, like, okay, everyone is going to be reminded of the fact that when you interview somebody, there may be some bias. And so can you be aware of that as you go into it, so that hopefully it's like top of your mind, right, when it happens. We standardize some of the ways in which we give guidelines, guardrails, and some aspects of the process, but don't standardize so much that you can't have the kind of that oops moment, or the, oh, this just came to me and we have a conversation because we went in a direction we didn't anticipate. And for anybody who's leading an organization or a team, those are the best moments, right? And my worry is that in trying to be fair and efficient and whatever, we're actually eliminating the opportunities for those kinds of human moments. Right, of creativity to exist.
And that's why I think probably the best interview process, at least for a young professional, is actually an internship. It's never been a, hey, I have a great resume, I have a great LinkedIn portfolio. It's, no, what can I do for the next 3 months? Because not only am I being interviewed, I'm also interviewing the company. And so their experience to not only connect with that person, see what the vibe is, see if they enjoy. I mean, there's so much richness that comes just from a human connection and a human experience than a, let me try to do an easy application because my LinkedIn profile meets 80% of the particular job, which again is a great tool. The intention is to raise awareness. Hey, Eric, you might be great for this job. Hey, Ulcca, you might be great for this job. Are you aware of this? Your network is doing this. That's awesome. But the premium experience, going back to our earlier conversation, is that hey, how do I build that connection so I could authentically come into that space and belong in that space?
And we know that that's often where the best hires happen, right?
Absolutely.
It is who you know. It's your social capital. I mean, LinkedIn is great, and occasionally a recruiter finds you, right? But it usually is those kinds of, again, the human piece, the relationship.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Ulcca, so as we're wrapping up here, one of the things I like to ask our guests is what questions you might have for me on this, right? I've had a blast having this conversation with you. I always do. But do you have any questions for me, or one question that you might you're curious about?
Well, I have two.
Okay.
So I'll ask you the substantive one kind of first, because I'm really curious sort of you've been asking me, what are you thinking about? Where are you going? I'm curious, the same with you. Obviously, the human experience and the future of the human experience. But are there things that you've been like seeing that are sort of niggling in the back of your mind where you're like, I'm seeing this. I want to learn more. I want to think more. I want to speak more with folks.
Well, you touched a part of it was actually behavioral economics. I'm really fascinated about as the space becomes more digitized and as we create more access to tools and to economic empowerment, what does that mean to communities coming online? I think you also brought up a perfect example of there are some organizations that are teaching people how to create apps. Well, we're about to get 1 billion more people connected to the internet by the end of 2030. What does that mean when you unlock those communities? Economically, education-wise, how do they have access to economic empowerment? So that is something that I've been curious about as someone that's, again, lived in a different country, have seen not only the unfortunate financial trauma of that sometimes, but the generational trauma that sometimes happens when you don't have access to certain economic opportunities because of the confines of the 20th century economic system, right? And so as the world gets more digitized, what does that look like? And so I've been fascinated about that space and probably exploring that in the coming years or in the coming months.
All right.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if there's an audience that you would like be your dream to give a talk to.
That's a great question. Wow. So I was privileged to do one of my talks in front of the American Montessori Society organization. And it's not necessarily, I know. and the reason why that was a really interesting audience for me to be a part of was because my kids were there and I got to tell my kids' story because they're also Montessori students. And I know we share that also in common with our families. But I also think that's a cop-out to your question.
I mean, think big,
I know. Singularity University has been one of the ones that, Peter Diamandis for me has been very similar to you and to other friends that have been in these spaces as thought leaders. He's the one that also pushed my thoughts into these different spaces. So he leads the Singularity University work and Abundance 360 and all that stuff. And so I think that would be a really fascinating space to share a little bit of my perspective or continue to build this work to one day be on that stage too.
And so shall it be,
all right,
or something even better.
So with that said, I not only am a big fan of your book, I highly recommend your book, The Future is Smart. But what books do you recommend for our audience to, after they've read your book, to dive into more of the concepts that not only you shared with us today, but maybe you want to plant some more seeds about the work that probably is coming for you and that's just been an inspiration for you?
Yeah, so I mentioned Annie Murphy Paul's The Extended Mind. I think Ian McGilchrist, his book, and I guess you can link to many of these. So if somebody is a nerd and really wants to nerd out, then read The Master and His Emissary. If you don't want to nerd out so much, there's a shorter book called The Divided Brain. There's also an RSA animate called The Divided Brain, and I recommend those. And then Leonard Schlein wrote a book. He's an artist and a historian, and he wrote a book called The Alphabet versus the Goddess. And it traces the rise of literacy across cultures and times. And one of the arguments that he makes that I think is very interesting is that Western alphabetic literacy coincided with the rise of things like patriarchy and the rise of ways of being in the world that I think of as being left hemispheric. And I'm really interested in that right now as we think about, I feel like we're at a moment of cultural shift, like at a global level. And I am thinking and writing about that more. And so I've gone back to that book because it has these big themes of like the human experience and journey. And I'm sort of curious now. I read it probably for the first time 10 years ago. But I'm curious, given
Okay.
where I am now, like what I see in it.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Ulcca Joshi Hansen, thank you so much
Thank
for being part of this conversation with me, not only today, but for your friendship, for your mentorship,
Thank
for your
you.
guidance on this journey. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much.
All that back to you. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.